They always say that the beginning is the easiest to remember. How light fell that evening, the exact phrase, the first time your hand fits into another's the way a key slides into an old door. I remember the beginning like a photograph tucked into a book, edges worn, colors a little dulled, but every detail still there when I opened the page. My name is Vivienne Clark. I was 30 years old when the world I'd been building for a decade collapsed under the weight of a man's ambition. I had a reputation then, meticulous, discreet, brilliant in the small public ways that make the kind of career people nod at grants won. Exhibitions sold, an editorial feature or two. I lived in Brooklyn in a pale apartment that loved the afternoon sun, and I had a small studio of my own where I painted and installed tiny public sculptures that smelled faintly of river water and oil paint. And then I met Damien Hale. Damien was everything the magazines whispered about. Tall, articulate, a financier with a soft laugh and a portfolio that read like a who list. He moved through the world with that rare combination of warmth and coldness, approachable enough to be liked, distant enough to be desirable. He courted me in a way that felt like a slow, careful unraveling, bouquets of quiet flowers, patronage at a small installation, introductions to people who seemed to matter. He told me he believed in my work. He wired money to the arts nonprofit I volunteered with. He put my shows on his calendar and introduced me as one of the city's quiet geniuses. It felt like recognition. It felt like being found. We did not start loudly. Ours was a slow binding dinners that blurred into deep conversations, weekends wandering a quiet part of the riverfront, drinks with his friends who were all on a cusp. He would look at me across a room and say, "You have this way of seeing what other people don't notice." I would laugh and think such a thing could not possibly have weight. When he asked me to move in, I wanted to say no because I had a stubborn shelter of independence I'd fought for my whole life. Instead, I folded my things and brought them to his loft, a place with high windows and the kind of minimalist art that belonged in his world. It had a coffee machine that hummed like contentment and a system for everything. For 2 years it was, almost perfect. I forget the small erasures, the tiny concessions I made. I forget how he'd tell me I was too much. When I painted with certain palettes, or when a friend of mine, a woman who smelled of thunder and coffee, came by and Damien winked in a way that made me assume I read the room wrong. I thought it was normal for relationships to smooth you, shape you. I thought it was normal to feel a little smaller in the shadow of another's certainty. Then there was the night. It seems almost absurd to recount it as a single moment, when in truth the betrayal had been building like rust beneath the lacquer. Still, there are decisive cuts in memory. For me, the cut happened in a hotel bar on the edge of the FDR Drive. Damien was working late. He had been in a string of meetings, pitching a fund to a group who thought art was a charming addition to a portfolio. I had my own small show opening that evening, but decided, because I loved him, to wait for him when he came home. I took a seat at the hotel bar, ordered a benign drink, and opened my phone just to check something, perhaps a message from a friend, a caption from a poet. A name flickered across the screen because someone else had messaged Damien. The name was short, flirty, obvious, L. My throat closed, not because of the name itself, but because of what I would later realize was like a shorthand to a whole other life. I asked myself then, naively, who is L? Maybe a colleague, a long-distance friend. The worst part about betrayal is this. The mind, stubborn as a child, will find ways to forgive. I followed him, not stalkingly, not like a character in a cheap thriller. I followed with the patient, legal kind of patience that history and boredom teaches you. I sat in a parked car 2 blocks away until the lobby door opened and he slipped inside. I watched him step into an elevator. I watched the numbers climb. When the elevator opened again, it was her he wrapped his arms around. Her laugh was the sound I had once mistaken for music. This woman, Lydia Mercer, was luminous, sharp, and so casually intimate with him that the world tilted. He did not look guilty, He seemed as if he'd never needed to be discreet. He kissed her like a man reaffirming a right he'd always assumed, the right to a secret. My hands did not shake. Perhaps that is the strangest thing. I just sat there and watched. I took the subway home and watched the city glide like a film through the window. The neon, the late night crowds, the garbage bags lined like unfortunate sentinels. My apartment felt foreign. His toothbrush in the cupboard, his shirt on a chair, relics of a life where my choosing mattered and suddenly did not. When he came in that night, he found me on the couch. His smile faltered and then became practiced. "We have to talk," he said. For a moment, I almost expected a confession, a broken apology, that dramatic unraveling that shows up in novels. Instead, he offered the smoothest of reassurances. "It was a mistake. She's only a friend. I didn't mean for you to find out like this." Do you know how much easier it is to listen to a liar if the liar's voice is the one you've loved into being? I sat and watched him put his hands out like a man trying to catch smoke. "Damien," I said slowly, "I saw you. I watched you touch her." He froze as if for the first time he saw his reflection too. "I can explain," he said. The words were rehearsed. I had heard this vocabulary before. Intimate, practiced, safe. Sounding. "Vive, this is not about you. It's a bad blur of a moment." He said it with the perfunctory regret of someone expressing sorrow for an inconvenience. I packed a small bag that night, a brush, a notebook, the spare key to the studio. I left everything else where it had been, the coffee cups, the books, the receipts. I left like a person stepping away from a stage before the curtains fall. For months after that, I tell people I collapsed. The truth is different. Truth is so much more mechanical. I split my life into tiny acts of survival. I called my sister in Queens and stayed with her between gigs. I slept in odd apartments and took freelance curation gigs and taught workshops for students whose hands smelled like clay and possibility. I avoided social media because every image of his smiling face felt like a debt collector's notice, but anger is a strange currency. It clear-sightedly bought me something I had not expected: focus. I began to think in lines and maps, diagrams of cause and effect. There is a certain talent in the human brain that wakes only when betrayed. It catalogs, inventories, and then calculates. If my world had been unmade, then there was nothing to lose by rebuilding it ruthlessly, strategically, with the sort of cold attention I had always reserved for my craft. At first, my plans were petty. I thought of ways to embarrass them, to leak a photo, to post a private text. But humiliation is cheap and noisy. I had never been noisy when it mattered. I had always been the quiet, the steady hand in the background, making sure things fit. I would not shout in public. I would not be fodder for gossip columns. I would be the stapled document that no one saw coming. So I began to map Damien. I sat in on exhibitions and fundraisers he attended. I watched how he moved his money, whom he called, which shareholders swallowed his hand and smiled. Damien's life, when you look closely, was a lattice of small compromises, a favor owed here, an investment pushed there. He loved the illusion of power. He mistook leverage for loyalty, and Lydia, she was more calculated than she seemed. You could tell by the way she touched him, like someone appraising currency. She had an art background too, which is always the first red flag in lovers of men with capital. The artistic self is often the easiest conduit for influence. She winked at me once at a gala, polished teeth flashing like a small coin. I did not flinch. I catalogued. The slow work of undoing someone begins with patience. I took a job at a different nonprofit and arts foundation that had connections with banks' philanthropic arms. That job was low profile, but it gave me access to people who moved the money Damien liked to parade. I hosted a fundraiser. I met board members. I drank coffee and listened. At night, back in my borrowed room, I pulled out my old notebooks. There were lists within lists, names, timelines, and a single steady thread of logic. If I could expose the structures that supported him, If I could awaken a single person to the truth, his entire architecture would fracture like bad concrete. I do not tell you this to sound clever. I tell you because the first stages of revenge are unspectacular. They are calls to forgotten friends, emails drafted and redrafted, tiny deposits and withdrawals noted. They are the science of minor movements. I reached for the one thing he never thought I'd ever touch, his ledger. Damien had kept a personal ledger, not digital, not hacked, but physical. Notes in a leather-bound book he carried to dinners, scribbles that named favors and obligations. He loved paper, never trusting the cloud. It was an old habit he picked up from his father, a man who had been a collector of rarities and secrets. One night, under the guise of needed closure, I returned to the loft. He slept upstairs. The building was breathing in the quiet of 2 a.m. I had a key, a courtesy that, like so many privileges men grant women when they think control is theirs, tasted like band notes and ease. I went into the study where the ledger lived and opened it with the softest of motions. There were pages of numbers, names, dates. I photocopied everything I could and slid the book back into place. I smelled him when I left his study, cologne and the faint dust of a life that was never fully anchored. You'll ask me then, with an almost human question, why the ledger? The ledger is a language of men like him. They confess on paper the ways they reframe the world, how favors become investments, how compliments are coded as debts. In those margins, I found things more damning than infidelity, transaction notes tied to philanthropic gifts that were in reality investment fronts, transfers to accounts that could be traced back to projects he and Lydia were financing under different names. He had mixed love and business with the arrogance of someone who thinks both are interchangeable. I had my proof, a photocopy of a quadrant of his life. The rest was a patient public architecture of collapse. I started to compile emails I could send anonymously to a journalist I'd once befriended, an old woman named Claire Nadir who loved the truth and knew how to make it sting. There is an ethical sediment in every act of revenge. I waded through mine like a diver in cold water. It was not clean. I contemplated what it would mean to send these things into the world. I weighed the humility of being the betrayed against the humility of being the avenger. At the edge of that silence, I made my choice. I sent Clara a single message. There's a ledger. I can prove it. Meet me at the 37th Street Diner at noon. She came with a pen and a face accustomed to disbelief. I gave her the photocopies and watched the way her eyes sharpened. The story that followed was not cinematic. There were calls, investigations, phone records cross-referenced. Damien called me and begged me to stop what I called a tempest. He was furious and scared and almost maniacal in his fear. In a single week, there were articles, column inches, board meetings, donations redirected. Lydia's name was on a list of beneficiaries of a creative trust. Her studio's funding suddenly looked like an embezzlement scheme. Damien was suspended from his advisory board. Sponsors withdrew, but the first cracks were only the beginning. You must understand, you cannot ruin a man simply by exposing a man. You must ruin the network that sustains him. So I kept watching and I kept working. Each name led to another, each small withdrawal to a larger one. I learned who panicked and who covered. I learned which friends are only skin deep. When Lydia confronted me, her voice pure venom masked as civility. How could you? Vive, do you know what this is doing? I had nothing to say that would help her. She tried to make me out to be a monster. She called me irrational. She implied I was acting out of petty spite. I let her call me what she liked. Names are feathers in a gale. They fall away if the wind is strong enough. By the time the firm's ethics committee convened, Damien's world had the look of a house whose foundations were poured on sand. People he'd once hugged were sending curt emails of distancing. He begged me for a compromise. I gave him a single, cold answer. I want nothing from you. I want the ledger public. I want the record clean. I wanted cleaning, not him. It is a strange power when you watch the lines someone else drew begin to unmake themselves. There is no joy in seeing a man's face strip of color, only a terrible, clear relief that the person who lied to you can no longer convince the room of the truth because the room now has its own record. Still, even as his fund collapsed and Lydia's projects folded, there was always a last reserve of cruelty left in them. They were human, and human beings are unpredictable. The night the paper published the first article, Damien drove past my old loft at a ridiculous speed, his face etched and raw, and banged on the door like a child demanding a bedtime story. I did not open it. The rest of that month was a slow, sharp unspooling for them. Trustees resigned, investors demanded audits, Lydia's name disappeared from her studio's plaque. They lost other things: privacy, reputation, the comfortable audacity of men who never expect to be taken to task. And me, I went home to a small room on the third floor of an old brownstone, brewed chamomile tea, and let the city hum. The truth feels sometimes like water. You drink and the burn fades. You drink and the edge is steady. But I tell you now, as I sit at a table with my tea cooling, and the city breathing through its own pain, the night of the ledger was not the end. It could not be. Because the ledger, for all its weight, was the beginning of a different, more complicated book. The one in which I had to figure out what I would become after I had taken everything back. When I walked out of Daniel's apartment that night, I wasn't the same girl anymore. The wind outside was cold, but my chest burned like a furnace. The betrayal had carved something out of me, something soft, naive, trusting, and left behind a hollow space filled with rage and clarity. For weeks I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't text him or her. I simply vanished. No posts, no replies, no explanations. I wanted them to wonder where I'd gone. I wanted the silence to choke them the way their lies had suffocated me. But revenge isn't just about hurting back. It's about reclaiming the power they stole from you inch by inch, breath by breath. So I started with myself. I began running every morning. At first, it was just to stop shaking from anxiety. Then it became therapy. Then control. I signed up for a business course at the local community college. I deleted our old photos, blocked his number, unfollowed everyone connected to that version of my life. The first real test came 3 months later when I saw them together again. At a friend's party, she was wearing my old leather jacket, the one Daniel used to call his favorite, and he had his arm around her waist the same way he used to with me. They looked happy, comfortable, proud. I felt a flicker in my chest, a mix of disgust and strange amusement. They thought they'd won. What they didn't know was that I'd already started something, a quiet, calculated plan. Daniel and I had once been partners in a small startup idea. He'd used my contacts, my savings, and my designs all under his name. "Because you're family now," he'd said, but he never removed me from the paperwork. And that, my dear friend, was his biggest mistake. Over the next few weeks, I pulled every document, every digital footprint, every transaction. I spent nights learning about intellectual property, legal rights, and small business clauses. And when I was ready, I called a lawyer, a woman named Clara Turner. She didn't just listen, she understood. It's not just about money. I told her, it's about taking back what he took, my dignity. She smiled. Then we'll make him pay for both. While the legal wheels turned, I played my part. I kept posting motivational stories, fitness progress, small achievements, not for him, for me, but I knew he watched. People like Daniel always do. They can't stand the thought of losing control over the person they broke. And then it happened. He texted me one night, "Hey, you've been looking good lately. Miss talking to you." I laughed. That text, so casual, so confident, was all I needed to know. He still thought I was that same weak girl. So I replied, "I was just thinking about you too." A lie that tasted sweeter than any truth. We met for coffee 2 days later. He looked exactly the same, maybe a little thinner, more tired. but his smile still carried that same arrogance. He talked about life, about business, about missing what we had. I listened, smiling. Every word he spoke was a note in the symphony of his own downfall, because while he thought he was charming me again, my lawyer was finalizing the case. Everything he had built using my work, every deal, every client, every penny was about to fall under investigation. The last thing he said before leaving that cafe was, "Maybe we can start over, huh?" And I said quietly, "Oh, we already have. You just don't know it yet." When he got the legal notice 2 weeks later, I was told he went pale. He called me nonstop. I didn't answer. Instead, I posted a quote on my story. She was quiet, not because she was weak, but because she was gathering evidence. By then, my heart didn't ache anymore. It felt steady, powerful, free, and yet, something in me knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. Because revenge isn't just about breaking your enemy. It's about rebuilding yourself so strong that they never break anyone again. And that part that's still to come. It had been 6 months since that morning when the legal notice hit Daniel like a thunderstorm. By now, he'd lost most of his clients. Investors were backing out. The startup that once felt like our dream was now under audit for fraud and intellectual theft. And me, I was calm, no shaking hands, no sleepless nights, no tears. I had finally learned the secret to revenge. It's not loud. It's quiet, controlled, calculated. I had moved into a new apartment overlooking the city. Every morning I made my coffee, opened my window, and looked out at the skyline that used to make me feel small. Now it made me feel infinite. One morning, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, I froze for a moment. It was Daniel. He looked hollow, dark circles under his eyes, a beard that wasn't trimmed, a shirt that looked worn out. He tried to smile, but it trembled halfway. "Can we talk?" he asked. His voice cracked. I didn't say yes, but I didn't shut the door either. He took that silence as permission and stepped inside. The air between us was heavy not with love, but with all the things he had broken. He looked around, noticing my books, my work files, my little plants by the window. "I see you've been doing well," he said softly. I folded my arms. "Better than ever." He sighed. "Clara, I made mistakes, I know. I was stupid, but do you really think I deserve to lose everything?" I met his eyes, those same eyes I used to lose myself in, and for the first time, I didn't see love. I saw weakness, yes. I said simply, "You do." He blinked, stunned. I walked past him and placed a folder on the table. "These are the documents you signed, Daniel. Every page where you used my work, my logo, my identity. You didn't just betray me, you stole from me." His shoulders slumped. I wasn't thinking. I thought we were in it together. I let out a breath that felt like years leaving my body. "I thought so too, until you slept with my best friend." The silence was sharp. He looked away, ashamed, but it was too late. The moment to apologize had passed long ago. "You know what hurts the most," I whispered. "Not that you cheated, not even that you stole. It's that you thought I wouldn't fight back, that I'd stay broken." His eyes filled with tears, real ones this time. "I never wanted to hurt you, but you did," I said, "and now you get to live with that." He stood there, speechless. I could see him trying to find the man he used to be, the one I had loved, but all that was left was a ghost of him. Before he left, he turned and said, "You've changed, Clara." I smiled, a small, quiet smile. "No, Daniel. I just stopped being the version of me you could control." When the door shut behind him, I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes. I expected to feel triumphant, victorious. Instead, I felt light, empty, but free, because revenge doesn't always taste like victory. Sometimes it tastes like closure. That night, I went to the beach, the same one Daniel and I used to visit. The waves were louder than I remembered, the wind colder. I sat there for hours, thinking of the girl who once cried for someone who never looked back, and I realized she was gone. In her place stood a woman who didn't need revenge to feel powerful anymore. She needed peace. I took my phone out, opened my notes, and wrote something that had been forming in my heart for months. "You don't destroy a monster by becoming one. you destroy it by surviving it and living better than it ever imagined. The next morning, I received an email. The case had officially closed. The rights to my designs were restored under my name. Daniel had agreed to a settlement. It was over. I called my lawyer, thanked her, and sat down by the window with my coffee. The city below buzzed with life, and for the first time in a long, long time, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like the author of my own story. I thought about everything, the pain, the betrayal, the anger, and I whispered to myself, "You did it, Clara. You got your justice." But the truth was, justice wasn't what I had found. It was myself, and that was worth every scar.